in IGAD. As you probably remember, no other country has been as much involved and has, I think, invested both material but also deployed troops at an early stage than Uganda. And in speaking with the Somalis, I think there is tremendous respect for what Uganda has done for Somalis over the years. And I think we probably will come to that debate later when we discuss ETMIS and the transition in January. But I think just to highlight the fact that these three countries have also been frontline states, very much involved in Somalia. So that is the sort of broad brush strategic, I think, overview of the Horn. I think two important waters are crucial. One, of course, as we suggested earlier, remains the Nile waters and its usage. It has been a source of major tussle between Egypt and Ethiopia historically for decades. Some progress was made when the two countries agreed on a negotiated settlement, but I think we saw Ethiopia embark on highly unilateralist steps and began the filling of the dam, and so it has completed the fifth, I think, filling of the dam, which technically means that the dam now is now a fait accompli. It cannot be reversed without massive to the entire Ethiopia. And here, I'm just alluding to even if Egypt wanted to strike the dam, now I think it will cause even far greater problem for itself because it will flood large territories. So probably the military option is now off the table, at least when it comes to striking the dam.
So that's interesting, but I wanted to just sort of clear another dimension. So you've got countries in this area, you've got countries that have an impact on which direction on what happens in this region. So there is Eritrea, there is Somalia, there is Ethiopia, there is, I don't know whether to call it the Sudan or Sudan, but the northern part of Sudan, and also the southern Sudan. And I would even push it a little further to include Chad. So let's just, am I stretching this, or am I right to say that the conflicts in the Central African Republic, in Libya, in the Sudan, and now whatever is left, or the remnants of, or whatever the rumblings in Somalia, there was the problem of Tigray. Is this history of civil conflict linked?
Absolutely. I think the Horn of Africa remains one of the most integrated regions in the world, also one of the most unstable. And I think the way in which also borders were arbitrarily demarcated or drawn by the colonial administration means that you have communities straddling both sides of the border, sometimes three borders. And this makes conflict generally spill over very quickly into beyond borders. You also have cross-clan or cross-ethnic mobilization across the frontiers. So it is very quickly for what starts often as a very localized dispute in certain border area quickly spreads, engulfing sometimes 2-3 borders. Then I think the nature of some of our conflicts has also begun. Our states are becoming more weaker. Insurgencies are growing along the periphery, also exploiting borders and exploiting the porous borders. We saw that with Al-Shabaab as well. And so what happens is armies become weaker, battling these insurgencies. So they reach out to external actors, and external actors, I think, become much more involved in African conflicts. And we see this externalization actually in the Horn of Africa, in the case of Sudan, where you have a host of foreign powers now directly involved in the conflict. And I think the risk I foresee also in Somalia is that now it will become a proxy theater where we will see Egypt and Ethiopia battle it out.
So then that's my next question. That, and these countries are of interest to me. So you've got countries like Djibouti, countries like Eritrea that are small but play an outsized role. So help me understand, in the configuration now, who is where? Who is with who? Because I'm now confused.
Yes, geopolitical alliances in the Horn are very fluid. They keep changing all the time. Yes, and interests also change. So we now have broadly two major camps. You have an emerging alliance between Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey on one side, and Egypt. Then you also have an alliance that brings together countries like the UAE and Ethiopia and Somaliland. So I think the race for shaping the geopolitics of the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden is now involving multiple actors who are changing their position. But I think, be careful here, because I don't want to generalize and say that alliances are solid. Alliances are generally very, very short-lived. They are also based on very tactical outcomes. And if that fails, exactly, consideration, and if that fails, they fall apart. So we now have a broad alignment, and this is a reconfiguration of what was there in 2017, when you had basically two camps. One was the Saudi Emirati camp, and the other was the Turkey-Qatar camp. So those are, just to highlight. Coming back to the second aspect of your question, yes, tiny Djibouti is a small state, but I think has the largest concentration of foreign armies in the whole of Africa, but also in the whole of Africa. There are roughly a dozen armies.
Wow.
Not very friendly armies as well.
Yes.
You have, for example, the United States base very close to the Chinese base, actually adjacent to the Chinese base. You also have China's base very close also to Japan's base. These are two hostile geopolitical powers who are, competing for dominance in Southeast Asia, in the Taiwan Strait. So these tensions elsewhere are also beginning to have an impact, I think, on Djibouti's as well. Then you also have traditional powers like France, which has consistently maintained its navy. The number of French troops, of course, have declined in recent years, but still, it is a major, French outpost in the Horn of Africa, in Africa. And if we see, the French pulling out from, of course, the Sahel, but has still maintained their presence in Djibouti, that I think speaks to the fact that it is one of at least the Elysee and France considers it, I think, a major geopolitical theater where they need to be present. And then I think just to highlight the fact that we have seen a resurgence, first of all, of piracy, but also the emergence of a new threat. The Houthi government in Yemen has basically stepped up attacks on shipping since the outbreak of the Gaza conflict. We have seen the size and the number of attacks increase, especially on ships that are related to Israel. But also, it has had a generally devastating impact on the entire shipping industry and maritime traffic on the Red Sea. So journeys are becoming longer, insurances are becoming higher. So the general cost of living crisis has now become much more pronounced, largely because of this, I think, Houthi threat on the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden.
So I just dropped you a question on your WhatsApp DM. So if you could just kindly reply, and also just send me Muridi and Abdi's address so that I can send them a request.
Yes, I will do that.
Yeah, while we do that, let me put a direct question. What is it in the Horn, in the Greater Horn, that is at stake driving all of these international powers to invest so much firepower and so much money in influencing the region? What are they trying to secure?
Good question. I think, first of all, traditionally, it has remained one of the most geostrategically significant territories in the Horn of Africa,
right?
Because it is the first African landmass which is adjacent to the Arabian coast, Arabian Peninsula. And that, of course, is where the bulk of world's known energy reserves were until fairly recently. So the traffic, especially from energy security, depended actually on these waterways, what is called freedom of navigation, being unhindered. So you had foreign navies actually maintain a footprint there, largely to make sure that the shipping, maritime traffic is not disrupted. So that is one, I think, reason. Then we saw also the resurgence of at least piracy from 2018 onwards. And although the incidents of piracy have declined, I think the concern has not completely gone away, and there has been an uptick, at least in the last few months since the start of the year in parts of Puntland. So as long as these threats haven't gone away, foreign armies will continue to maintain presence. Then, of course, I think another important factor is the fact that we have also growing insurgencies. The bulk of, at least a chunk of Yemen is now controlled by Al-Qaeda in the Arab Peninsula. Al-Qaeda in the Arab Peninsula is an insurgency which wants to take over Yemen. Then you also have an affiliate of the jihadists in Yemen, that is Al-Shabaab, who are also resurgent in Somalia. Then you also have the Houthis, who have recently established some form of linkages with Al-Shabaab. So the growing terror threat and the proliferation of these armed insurgencies and groups makes it imperative for at least states in the region, but also states farther away in Europe, North America, to have an interest and a stake in these waterways and to have a presence. So that explains, I think, the geostrategic significance of this terrain. But also, you probably have economic interest as well, especially oil and gas in offshore, the Lamu Basin and so on.
What's the story with securing sources of food, and what's the effect of the whole gold thing and the involvement of Russians, the involvement of Americans, and all? What, in other words, natural resources? What's that story?
I think, first of all, Ethiopia remains one of the most, from just water resources point of view, one of the most better endowed states in Africa, also has vast arable land, which is suitable for agriculture. Now, the Gulf and most of the Arab states are highly food insecure. A country like Qatar, for example, almost exclusively imports all its food from foreign sources. So it is entirely dependent on foreign sources. Now, countries in the Gulf recognize that they are racing against time to secure a post-oil future. They know that oil is not going to last, fossil fuels are not going to last, so they are making plans for a transition away from a fossil economy or an economy that is reliant on old fossil fuels. So they are transitioning to green energy or building technologies that will help them at least steer the difficult path ahead. But also in terms of food security, they have been looking towards countries like Sudan, Kenya, but also Ethiopia for arable land where they can invest in agriculture. And we see this process has been gaining momentum in Ethiopia, but also in Sudan. Despite the disruption of conflict and warfare, these two countries remain at the highest, they are highly coveted by the Gulf, largely because of their water resources, but they are, I think, abundant agricultural land. So that is one also driver of the Gulf interest in these. But also there are small countries with also significant minerals. For example, Eritrea has significant minerals.
Really?
Exactly, gold and other forms of rare minerals.
Really?
You also exactly, and also Sudan has vast gold deposits in the Darfur. Actually, one of the most war-torn parts of Sudan. So this, although this part of the Horn has not become like DR Congo, you have, I think, a lot of first of all exploration for rare earth minerals, but also exploitation of gold. So these are also drivers of external interest in the Horn, and sometimes these external actors become very much directly involved with the conflict. For example, RSF, which is very much involved in the war in Sudan, made its wealth from the gold trade and benefits a lot from the gold trade.
So, Rashid, one of the things I want you to touch on is where does that leave the ATMIS, the African Union forces? And so, first of all, at the technical level of the forces that are on the ground, contributed by the African Union, and where does that leave Europe, which has also been a key part of the dynamic there? So that's the first part of the question. But I also would like you to speak to what it actually means. What are the implications? How should Uganda and Kenya, who are now one of the big troop contributors, how should they be strategically positioning in light of these developments?
Yes, I think that's a good question, and it remains, I think, the topmost priority for these states. Now, the AMISOM mission, which has now been renamed AUSOM, at least from January 2025,